Thursday, 20 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. Hargrove and Sons Hardware, on the east side of Billings, Montana. A woman in a charcoal theory blazer stepped through the front door and immediately knocked a display of PVC fittings off the end cap with her elbow. She did not stop to pick them up. The two younger employees at the back of the store exchanged a look. Ray Kowalski, the floor manager, was already moving toward her with the particular energy of a man who had spotted an opportunity, wearing expensive shoes. In the far aisle, near the lumber cutting station, a man in a faded canvas apron was kneeling beside a flatbed cart, counting box nails into a paper bag for an elderly customer who had driven 40 minutes from Laurel because this was the only hardware store that still did it that way. His name was Patrick Sully. He had been working at Hargrove's for 14 months. He wore the apron because it had a pocket for his phone, and his phone had a photograph of a 7-year-old named Becca on the lock screen, and he liked to look at it between customers. The woman in the blazer did not look at Patrick. She did not notice him. Almost no one did, at first. Her name was Joanna Marsh. She was 38 years old, and she had driven directly from the airport, which explained the blazer and the carry-on she had left in the rental car, and the look on her face that said she had not eaten since Dallas. She needed a load-bearing wall assessment on a commercial property her company had just acquired. And she needed it in the next 48 hours, and the structural engineer she had flown in from Phoenix had texted her from the gate that he had food poisoning and was not getting on the plane. Ray reached her first. He was 45, had a laminated store certification pinned to his vest, and smiled the way men smile when they assume competence is about to be purchased. "Can I help you find something?" Joanna told him what she needed. Not a product, a person, someone who understood load-bearing walls in pre-1970 commercial construction, specifically steel, post, and beam, specifically in a building that had been modified at least 3 times without documentation. Ray nodded slowly, performing comprehension. "Absolutely, that's something we can get you sorted on." He paused. "We have a consultation binder up front with our preferred contractors." "A binder?" "Yes, ma'am. Full color, laminated." Joanna looked at him the way a person looks at a binder when they needed an engineer. From the lumber aisle, Patrick had finished with the elderly man and was now replacing the PVC fittings that had been knocked off the end cap. He was doing it quietly without being asked, fitting each cap back onto the display hook in the correct size order. He had a way of making himself small in the store, not out of insecurity, but out of practice. He had learned that the fastest way to get through a day without incident was to fill the space you occupied with useful work and let the noise happen around you. He heard Ray say load-bearing wall. He heard steel, post, and beam. He heard pre-1970. He kept replacing the fittings. Ray was steering Joanna toward the front counter now, already pulling out the binder, already talking about turnaround times and quote processes and preferred vendor relationships. Joanna was not looking at the binder. She was looking at her phone. She was doing the math on 48 hours and coming up short. Patrick stood up. He picked up the flatbed cart. He wheeled it 2 aisles over and began restocking lag bolts because that was what was next on his list. He had not said anything. He was not going to say anything. And then Joanna said, to no one in particular, to the ceiling, to the particular kind of frustration that doesn't have a target. Does anyone in this building actually know what a moment frame connection looks like? Ray laughed, a little too quickly. Our contractors are all fully certified. Patrick stopped moving the cart. He turned. He looked at the woman in the blazer, not at Ray. He looked at the specific exhaustion on her face, the way her jaw was set, the way her left hand was already reaching for her phone again, because she already knew this conversation was not going to give her what she needed. He said quietly from the aisle, "What's the span?" Ray turned. His expression shifted. Joanna turned. She looked at the man in the canvas apron, the lag bolts in his hand, the faded blue of the apron, worn soft at the shoulder. "Excuse me," Patrick said it again. "What's the span between posts?" Joanna blinked. 42 feet, east-west. The north wall has an addition from probably 1962. The beam on that side is sistered, and I don't know if the original connection is still carrying load, or if they just built around it. Patrick set the lag bolts down on the shelf, not because he was done with them, because he needed both hands to think. If they sistered without removing the original, the new beam is probably carrying cosmetic load, and the original is still structural. You'd see it in the deflection pattern on the floor above. Does the floor have any soft spots? Anywhere it moves underweight near that north wall? Joanna stared at him. Yes, 2 of them. About 6 feet apart. That's your connection points. They're still transferring load. The sister is cosmetic. If your engineer is planning to modify that north wall, he needs to know the original beam is still in the load path, or he's going to design around something that isn't there and build into something that is. Ray had stopped pretending to look at the binder. The 3 of them stood in the aisle between PVC fittings and lag bolts and the hum of the store's fluorescent lighting, and for a moment no one said anything. Joanna said, "Who are you?" Patrick picked the lag bolts back up. Patrick Sully, I work in the hardware aisle. She looked at his hands. Not the apron, not the bolts, his hands. The particular way they had stilled mid-motion when he was thinking, the way a person's still when the thinking is happening behind the eyes, and the rest of the body is just waiting. She had a good eye for hands. Her father had taught her that. He had been a general contractor for 31 years, and he had told her once that you could tell everything about how a man understood a building by the way he held a level. Ray tried to recover. We really do have the binder, Joanna said to Patrick. Can I show you the photos? She pulled out her phone and held it toward him. He looked at the photographs for 90 seconds. He did not take the phone from her hand. He leaned in slightly, turned his head slightly, the way someone leans into a problem they have already seen the shape of. He said, your sistered beam has a 3-inch gap between the original and the new member. That's visible right here. He tapped the screen without touching it. If there's a gap, they weren't bonded. Which means load transfer is happening through the bolts only. Depending on the bolt pattern, you may have adequate capacity, or you may have a joint that's been in slow creep for 60 years and nobody noticed because nothing dramatic happened. Joanna said, how do you know about bolt pattern creep in post and beam construction from a photograph? Patrick straightened up. He handed her back her phone by not taking it. He said, I used to do this for a living. He went back to restocking the lag bolts. Ray did not say anything else. That evening, Joanna sat in her rental car in the parking lot of a hotel on the north end of Billings and called her project manager in Seattle. I found someone, she said. Who? A hardware store employee. He diagnosed a sistered beam fault from a photograph. Joe, I know you cannot hire a hardware store employee to assess a commercial acquisition. I know that. Then why are you telling me? She looked at the windshield. Because something about this is wrong, and I need to figure out what it is before I walk away from it. She hung up. She sat for a while longer. Then she opened her laptop and typed Patrick Fillings, Montana structural engineer into the search bar and looked at what came back. The results were not empty. They were the opposite of empty. They were the kind of results that do not make sense unless something has happened. A man whose name was on 3 published papers in structural engineering journals between 2013 and 2018. A man who had been cited in 2 FEMA post-disaster assessment reports. A man whose firm, Sully Crane Engineering, had been licensed in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, and had dissolved in 2019. She searched for the reason it had dissolved and found nothing, the kind of nothing that meant someone had been careful. She closed the laptop. At the same hour, in a 2-bedroom house 8 blocks from the hardware store, Patrick was making grilled cheese sandwiches because Becca had decided she did not want the spaghetti he had already made, and he had decided not to fight that particular battle on a Thursday. Becca was 7 and precise about food. She had her mother's precision about most things, which Patrick noticed sometimes with an ache that had changed shape over the years from sharp to wide, the way a river changes when it meets flat land. He had been noticing it more lately. He did not know exactly why. She was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing. She drew the way she did everything, with complete focus, her tongue between her teeth, her small shoulders squared. Daddy, the lady at your store today, she had on a nice jacket. Patrick turned. You came by today? Mom dropped me. You were busy. He paused. Busy how? Talking to the lady about the building. He had not told Becca about his work at Hargrove's in any detail. Not the specific detail of what he did there. He had told her he worked at a hardware store and she had accepted this, the way 7-year-olds accept the facts of their lives, completely and without comparison. He said, you should have come and found me. I didn't want to interrupt. He turned back to the grilled cheese. He listened to her crayon on the paper. He listened to the house settle. He listened to the particular silence of 2 people who have learned to be a unit of 2 and have made peace with it. Mostly, most days. He thought about the woman in the blazer, the specific way she had asked who he was, and then not seemed to know what to do with the answer. He had told her he used to do this for a living. He had not told her anything else. She had not asked right then. Though she had been about to, he had not lied. He had simply stopped talking. The way he had learned to stop, the way you learn to stop when stopping, is the only thing that keeps the rest of it from coming. 3 weeks before Sully Crane Engineering dissolved, Patrick had been in the field on a commercial retrofit in Missoula when the call came. His business partner, Derek Crane, had been handling a residential project in Bozeman, a renovation. A client who had insisted on removing a wall that Patrick had flagged 3 times in writing as load-bearing. Derek had agreed to the removal under a modification to the original scope that Patrick had not reviewed, because Patrick was in Missoula, and the deadline was close, and they were both tired and running on 2 projects simultaneously. The wall came down on a Tuesday morning. The ceiling followed it by 11 minutes. No one had been in that room. That part was luck, the only luck in the whole story. But the homeowner had sued, and the investigation had found the modification approval, and the modification approval had Derek's signature, and Derek's signature was on a firm whose name included Patrick, and Patrick had been in Missoula and had not signed anything, and could not have signed anything, and had said in writing 3 times, "Do not touch that wall." None of that had mattered in the way he had expected it to matter. The licensing board had found insufficient oversight. The word insufficient had cost him his license. Derek's license was suspended, then reinstated after appeal. Patrick's appeal had been denied. The reasons were in a document he had not read since the day it arrived. He did not need to read it. He had memorized it without meaning to, the way you memorize the things that end your life as you knew it. He had a daughter who was 4 years old, and a mortgage on a house that was now too big, and a name that showed up in one news article he had found once and had never searched for again. He had taken the hardware store job because it was 8 blocks from Becca's school, and the manager had not asked about his background, and the work was honest. He was good at it. He was good at most things he did with his hands and his head. He had learned that being good at something was not the same as being allowed to do it. In the morning, Joanna was at the hardware store before it opened. She was standing at the glass door with 2 coffees from the place down the block, which Ray, who was opening up, found both flattering and slightly alarming. She was not there for Ray. Patrick arrived at 7:50. He came in through the side door, the way he always did, and did not see her until he had already tied his apron and was heading toward the lumber section to start the morning count. She was standing in the PVC aisle. She held out a coffee. He took it because refusing would have taken more energy than he had before 8 o'clock. She said, "I looked you up." He said, "I figured you might." There was a pause. She said, "Sully Crane." "Yes. I read the licensing board decision." He looked at his coffee. She said, "I also read your 3 written objections to the modification, the ones dated before the incident." He looked up. The board's file was a public record. It was all in there. She paused. "I don't think the decision was right." Patrick did not say anything for a long moment. In the 4 years since the license had been pulled, no one in a position to know the difference had ever said that to him. His lawyer had said it would be difficult to overturn. His mother had said it was not fair, which was different from wrong in a way that mattered. A friend from graduate school had said, "I'm sorry, man," which meant nothing and everything at the same time. He said, "What do you want? I want you to look at the building, not as a contractor, not officially. Just look at it with me and tell me what you see. That's not how assessments work. I know that. I'm not asking for an assessment. I'm asking for your eyes." He thought about what that meant. He thought about what it would cost him if something went wrong. He thought about the fact that something could only go wrong if he was wrong, and he did not think he was wrong. He said, "Send me the full photo set, all of them. I'll look tonight." "That's not enough," he said. "It's what I have." She looked at him, the apron, the coffee he was holding with both hands, the careful stillness of someone who has learned to be very precise about what he offers and what he keeps. She said, "Becca's in 2nd grade at Rimrock Elementary. I passed it on the way here." He went very still. Then, slowly, he said, "How do you know my daughter's name?" "It was on a photo, on your phone. When you unlocked it to show me the floor plan specs yesterday, the lock screen." She looked at him steadily. I'm not saying that as a threat. I'm saying it because I want you to know that I'm paying attention to all of it." He looked at her for a long time. The way you look at someone when you are trying to decide if they are the kind of person who means what they say, or the kind who says what they mean to get what they want, and whether the difference matters. He said, "I'll come by at noon." 1 hour. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't thank me yet." The building was on Montana Avenue, 3 blocks from the train tracks. It was a 1958 post and beam commercial structure that had been a furniture warehouse, then a print shop, then nothing, for 11 years. Joanna's company had acquired it as part of a portfolio deal. Her job was to determine if it could be converted to mixed-use residential, or if the structural modifications required would exceed the acquisition value. Patrick walked through it without speaking for 22 minutes. He did not have instruments. He had his hands and his eyes and 40 feet of contractor's tape that Joanna had brought, without being asked, because she had been on enough assessments to know what the person looking at the building always needed. He pressed his palm flat against the north wall. He crouched and looked at the base of the original beam. He stood in the center of the floor above the worst soft spot and bounced his weight, very slightly, twice, and listened. Joanna did not ask him anything. She had learned, somewhere in 10 years of site work, that the worst thing you could do when someone was reading a building was talk to them while they were reading it. He said, finally, "The original connection is intact. It's sound." The sister beam was added in the early 80s, probably for a mezzanine load that was later removed. The sister is carrying nothing now. You could remove it. He crouched at the southwest corner. "This corner has a footing issue. It's been patched, but the patch is failing. If you put residential load on the upper floor without addressing this first, you'll have a problem in 3 to 5 years. Not immediately, but 3 to 5 years. He stood up, he said, "The north wall is fine. The southwest corner is not." Joanna wrote it down. She did not say anything. He said, "You already knew something was wrong in that corner." "Yes," he said. "Your original engineer, the one who got food poisoning, was he going to clear the whole building?" She looked at the corner. "He was going to do a visual and call it code compliant." Patrick said, "That would have been expensive for you later." She said, "I know." They stood in the empty building with the afternoon light coming in flat through dirty warehouse windows. Somewhere outside, a freight train was moving on the tracks. The building vibrated barely, and Patrick watched the beam above them and did not look worried, and Joanna noticed that he was watching it in a very specific way. "The way you watch something you trust," she said. "Why are you working at a hardware store?" He said. "Because they hired me." "That's not what I mean." He looked at the beam. He said, "I made the decision to close the firm after the license was pulled. Derek rebuilt his practice. I didn't want to rebuild it in his shadow, and I didn't want to start over under my own name and explain the licensing board to every new client. I had a 4-year-old. I needed something that started at 7:30 and ended at 4 and didn't follow me home." She said, "Does it work? Not following you home?" He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had not quite allowed himself to look before. He said, "Some days." That evening, Joanna did not call her project manager. She sat in the hotel room and opened her laptop and started typing a memo, not to her project manager, but to the Montana Board of Engineers. She had done this kind of filing once before, for a different reason, in a different state. She knew what the forms looked like. She knew what evidence was required for a petition to reconsider a disciplinary action. She had Patrick's 3 written objections. She had the original modification approval with Derek's signature. She had the board's public file. She had the timeline, which anyone who read it carefully could see was not the story that had been told to the board. She was not doing this as his employer. She was not doing this for the building. She was doing it because she had read a public document that was wrong, and she had enough legal resources to say so, and she had learned from her father that the worst thing you could do with a wrong thing was look at it and keep walking. She did not tell Patrick. She was not going to tell Patrick. Not yet. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, a woman from the state licensing office called Hargroves and asked to speak with Patrick Sully. Ray came to find him in the lumber aisle, looking slightly bewildered. "The state is on the phone for you." Patrick picked up the receiver at the front counter. He listened for 4 minutes. He said, at the end, "Can you say that again?" The woman said it again. A formal petition had been filed requesting reconsideration of his license suspension. New evidence had been submitted, specifically the timeline documentation and the original engineering objections from the Bozeman project. The board had agreed to hold a reconsideration hearing. It was not an appeal. It was a full reinstatement review. He said, "Who filed the petition?" There was a pause. The filer is listed as Marsh Development Group, represented by their general counsel, with a supporting statement from Joanna Marsh, Director of Acquisitions. Patrick stood at the front counter of a hardware store in Billings, Montana, with a telephone receiver in his hand, looking at a point on the wall above the cash register that was not anything, just wall. Ray said, "You okay?" Patrick said, "Yeah." He hung up. He stood there for another moment. Then he took off his apron and went to find his keys. Becca's school let out at 3:15. It was 2:40. He drove to the hotel. He did not call first. He parked in the lot and sat in the car for 90 seconds and then went inside. She was in the lobby with her carry-on and her blazer, because she was leaving at 4, and she looked up when the door opened and her face moved through something she had not expected to need to control. He crossed the lobby. He stopped 2 feet from her. He said, "You didn't tell me." "No." He said, "Why?" "Because you would have said don't." He looked at her. She was right. He would have said don't. He would have said it was fine, that he had made his peace with it, that it was a long time ago, that Becca was happy and he was managing. He would have said all of those things and none of them would have been true in the way that mattered. He said, "It might not work." She said, "I know." He said, "The board might not reconsider." She said, "I know that too." He said, "Then why?" She looked at him. She said, "Because you read that building the way my father used to read buildings. The way someone reads something they love. And because it was wrong, and I had the resources to say so, and I did not want to be the kind of person who looks at a wrong thing and keeps walking." He stood very still. She picked up the handle of her carry-on. "She had a flight," he said. "Joanna," she stopped. He said, "My daughter wants to know if you're coming back to Billings." Joanna turned. She looked at him. She said, "What did you tell her?" He said, "I told her I didn't know yet." She stood in the hotel lobby with her carry-on and the afternoon light coming through the glass doors. And a man, looking at her the way she had not been looked at in a long time. Quietly and completely, the way a person looks at something they have decided is worth the risk of looking at. She said, "Ask her if Saturday works." He said, "It works." The reconsideration hearing was 6 weeks later. Patrick wore his good suit, the one that had been in a garment bag since 2019, and it still fit, which surprised him slightly. Robert Crane, Derek's father and the former senior partner of the firm that had preceded both of them, came from Bozeman to testify. He was 71 years old and he had driven 4 hours, and he did not need to be there legally, and he came anyway, because some things do not need a legal reason. Robert told the board what he knew about the Bozeman project, about the modification approval, about Derek's decision and Patrick's objections, and the timeline that the original hearing had not examined carefully. He said it plainly without performance, the way a 71-year-old man says things he has waited too long to say. The board's lead attorney asked Patrick 3 questions. He answered all 3 without looking at his notes, because the facts had been in him for 4 years, and there was nowhere else they could have gone. The license was reinstated on a Wednesday afternoon in November. Full reinstatement. Clean record. Patrick drove to Rimrock Elementary and picked up Becca and told her in the car, without ceremony, because Becca was 7 and she processed information better without ceremony. She said, "Does that mean you can do the thing with the buildings again?" He said, "Yes." She was quiet for a block. Then she said, "Can I come sometimes, when you go to the buildings?" He said, "Sometimes, yeah." She seemed satisfied. She put her feet on the dash, which he usually did not allow, and he did not say anything about it. That Saturday, Joanna drove a rental car she was beginning to recognize her way around, and parked in front of Hargrove's Hardware, not because she had business there, but because Becca had asked to show her the store. Specifically, the nail display, which Becca had decided was interesting. Patrick was not working there anymore. He had given Ray 2 weeks' notice and a thorough handoff, and a thank you that he meant in a way he was not sure Ray had understood. Ray had shaken his hand, and then given him the apron, folded, in a paper bag, because Ray was the kind of man who knew when something had weight. Becca pushed through the front door of the hardware store with the authority of someone who had been here many times and knew which aisle had the interesting things. She went directly to the nail display, which was, in fact, a very organized and specific display, and explained to Joanna in complete sentences why the sizing system worked the way it did, most of which she had learned from listening to her father talk to customers when she had come in after school on the days her mom had early meetings. Joanna crouched down and looked at the nail display as if it were worth looking at, because Becca was explaining it as if it were worth looking at. And that was enough. Patrick watched the two of them from the end of the aisle. He watched Becca point at the sixpenny nails and say something, and Joanna's head tilt while she listened. He watched Becca take Joanna's hand without asking, because she did things like that, because she had not yet learned the hesitation. He watched Joanna's hand close around hers. He thought about the building on Montana Avenue, which he had agreed to assess properly now, officially, with his reinstated license and his own signature on the report. He thought about the southwest corner and what it would take to fix it, and how the fix, done right, would give the building 50 more years. He thought about the moment frame connections in the north wall, which were sound, which had been sound all along, which no one had trusted because the surface looked worn. He thought, sometimes the structure is fine. Sometimes you just need someone willing to put a hand on it and listen. Becca tugged Joanna toward the next aisle. Patrick followed. Outside, through the store's glass front, Billings kept going about its afternoon. A truck with a flatbed, a woman walking a dog the size of a small couch, the particular pale gold of a Montana November sky, the kind that looks like it will last about an hour and then turn cold. Inside, a 7-year-old was explaining the difference between wood screws and drywall screws to a woman in a good blazer who was listening as if this were the most important information she had received all week, and a man in a good coat stood 2 aisles over watching them and deciding, without making a production of it, that this was what it looked like when something you had stopped letting yourself want came back, and simply stood in the nail aisle of a hardware store and waited for you to catch up. He caught up. He said to both of them, "There's a diner on the corner that does a good pie." Becca said. "What kind?" he said. "Apple," she said. "We're going." Joanna stood up. She looked at him across the top of Becca's head, and she smiled, and it was the kind of smile that didn't need anything added to it. They went.